The story begins not with a crown, but with a whisper, a faint sound carried across candlelit corridors, through the velvet-draped chambers of forgotten palaces, where secrets weighed more than gold. Empires were not built by swords alone, nor were they held together by loyalty or faith. They were shaped, instead, by the quiet pulse of fear and the deliberate art of concealment. In every age, behind the brilliance of jewels and ceremony, there existed a darker world, one woven with letters sealed in wax, hands that trembled with intent, and words that could change destinies when spoken at the right ear. The light of history has always been kind to monarchs. It reflects the shimmer of their crowns and the splendor of their courts. Yet, when the lamps burn low and the halls fall silent, shadows tell another story entirely. To imagine the life of a ruler is to picture grandeur, but the truth is far less luminous. Beneath every royal portrait lies a trace of anxiety, the unspoken awareness that a throne, no matter how gilded, stands upon uncertain ground. Alliances forged in public were often poisoned in private, and those who smiled beside the throne sometimes plotted its fall. Power invited devotion, but it also summoned envy, and the most dangerous enemies were rarely the ones seen on the battlefield. They sat beside the king at dinner, wrote the queen's letters, and walked through the same marble corridors, cloaked in courtesy. The palace, that glittering symbol of order, was often the most chaotic place of all. If one were to drift through history as through a dream, they would find this pattern repeating again and again. The same delicate balance between order and intrigue, affection and betrayal. Ancient kingdoms rose under banners of divine right, yet behind each coronation, there lingered the murmur of hidden bargains. Crowns were not inherited by blood alone, but by strategy, silence, and sometimes the quiet removal of those who stood in the way. The beauty of monarchy lay not merely in its pageantry, but in the unseen machinery that turned behind the curtain, a machine built of secrets. Even now, historians chase these elusive truths like moths circling a flame. They pore over faded manuscripts, decode the softened ink of confession, and debate the motives of long-dead sovereigns. But history, like power itself, guards its mysteries well. Some truths were never written at all. They lived and died in the guarded hearts of those who feared the price of revelation. A conspiracy that succeeds leaves no trace. It vanishes into the fabric of accepted history, indistinguishable from fact. Perhaps that is why these stories endure, because they offer the comfort of wondering, the soft ache of what might have been. To listen to them is to linger at the edge of twilight, where fact and imagination blend into something timeless. Close your eyes and picture it. The glow of torchlight flickering against tapestries, the muted sound of footsteps in the distance, a door creaking softly on its hinges. Somewhere, a king signs his name on a secret decree. Somewhere else, a queen hides a letter beneath her pillow, its contents enough to shift the fate of nations. These are not just tales of greed or betrayal. They're reflections of human desire, the longing to hold power, the fear of losing it, and the desperate need to control what cannot be controlled. Empires are born from such contradictions, from the fragile dance between light and shadow, truth and deception. What is a conspiracy, if not an attempt to master uncertainty? Rulers, no matter how absolute, could never command the hearts of their people. They could only shape perception, build myth strong enough to outlast reality. And so they surrounded themselves with symbols, crowns, anthems, rituals. The appearance of stability became the greatest illusion of all. Behind the music of ceremonies and the fragrance of roses at coronations, there is always the silent hum of fear, a reminder that every dynasty carries the seed of its own undoing. The higher the throne, the deeper the shadow it casts. But darkness does not only corrupt, it protects. In those shadows, alliances were formed that saved kingdoms from ruin. Whispers have preserved peace as often as they have started wars. Perhaps the line between conspiracy and wisdom is thinner than we imagine. Perhaps the stories we now call sinister were once acts of survival. A queen's cunning, a minister's deception, a lie told not for greed, but for the fragile continuation of order. The past, when seen through the calm lens of night, is not a simple record of good and evil. It is a mosaic of intentions, where every piece glimmers differently depending on the light. And so, as we step into this journey together, let the noise of the world fade away. Let the centuries unfold softly, one after another, revealing not battles and treaties, but secrets whispered through time. The story of royal conspiracies is not a tale of monsters, nor of heroes. It is a meditation on power itself, on how it shapes, seduces, and haunts those who hold it. We will wander through the courts of kings and queens, walk silently beside their confidants, and peer through the veil of history to glimpse the fragile humanity beneath the crown. In the chapters that follow, we will uncover lost heirs, vanished empires, and letters written in invisible ink. We will move from the marble halls of Florence to the frozen palaces of Russia, tracing how conspiracies shaped not just rulers, but entire civilizations. The journey will not be rushed. Each story will unfold like a dream, gentle and deliberate, carrying us deeper into the timeless space where truth fades into mystery. So breathe slowly and listen carefully. The night is long, the past is restless, and the crowns that glitter in memory still cast their shadows across the world. In the heart of revolutionary France, beneath the trembling roar of a nation unmade, there once lived a child who was born to rule the world but never learned what it meant to be free. His name was Louis Charles, the Dauphin of France, the little prince who would become Louis XVII if only fate had allowed. When he was born in 1785, Versailles shone brighter than ever, its mirrors gleaming like captured sunlight, its gardens breathing the perfection of control. The people cheered, the bells rang, and destiny seemed to settle comfortably upon the cradle of the heir to the Bourbon line. But history, as always, has a cruel way of turning its own pages. Within a decade, that same world of opulence would crumble into dust, and the walls that once echoed with music would ring only with silence and fear. The revolution began as an idea: liberty, equality, fraternity, but it soon became a storm that could not distinguish between justice and vengeance. When the guillotine rose in Paris, so too did suspicion. The monarchy fell, and with it, the great illusions of divine right. King Louis XVI was executed on a cold January day, his final words swallowed by the noise of the crowd. Not long after, his queen, Marie Antoinette, met the same fate, her composure as fragile as the lace that once adorned her gowns. Yet between these two tragic figures remained a child, hidden away in a stone cell, too young to understand the crimes of which his family had been accused. The world had crowned him Louis XVII, but in truth, his kingdom was no larger than the damp prison walls that surrounded him. The Temple prison was a place of silence. Its stone corridors muffled every sound, and its narrow windows admitted only a thin ribbon of light. There, the young Dauphin was kept under guard, torn from his mother, denied education, play, and human warmth. Reports from the time describe him as frail, fevered, and frightened, a child with the blood of kings, forgotten by both his protectors and his enemies. His jailers, hardened by ideology, refer to him not as a prince but as the wolf cub. To them, he was the embodiment of tyranny, the living memory of a monarchy they sought to erase. And so they set about erasing him one day at a time. When news of his death was announced in 1795, the world barely paused. France was at war, its people exhausted, its future uncertain. The official record declared that the boy had succumbed to disease and neglect at the age of 10. His body, they said, was buried without ceremony in a nameless grave. But almost immediately, whispers began to circulate, whispers that would not die for more than 2 centuries. Some claimed the body in the coffin was not the Dauphin at all. Others insisted that loyalists had smuggled him out of prison, replaced him with another sickly child, and spirited him away to safety under the cover of darkness. If the rumors were true, then somewhere the true king of France might have lived in hiding, watching the empire that was once his slip further from memory. As the years passed, impostors began to appear, each more convincing than the last. There was Karl Wilhelm Naundorf, a clockmaker from Prussia who claimed to be the lost Dauphin. He spoke of secret passages in Versailles, of servants whose names had never been recorded, of lullabies sung in the Queen's voice. He bore scars said to match those inflicted during imprisonment, and his handwriting resembled that of the royal child. Many who had known the court swore he was telling the truth. Yet there were others, skeptics, historians, and descendants of revolutionaries, who dismissed him as a fraud. Still, when he died in 1845, his tombstone read, Louis XVII, King of France, a title both denied and believed by the world he left behind. There were others, too, children found in convents, men emerging from obscurity with tales of survival, all claiming to be the ghost prince returned to reclaim his birthright. Their stories captivated the weary imagination of Europe. Newspapers printed their faces beside faded portraits of the royal child, comparing every curve, every expression. Each new claimant offered the same promise, that innocence had survived the terror, that the last spark of the old world still flickered somewhere in the dark. The mystery was not simply about bloodlines. It was about longing, the longing for closure, for restoration, for proof that something pure could escape the machinery of revolution. More than 100 years later, in the 20th century, science entered the story. When the remains of the child said to be Louis XVII were re-examined, a small preserved heart, taken from his autopsy, became the focus of attention. DNA analysis compared it to the genetic material of living descendants of Marie Antoinette. The results, announced with quiet certainty, declared that the heart did indeed belong to the lost Dauphin. The boy had died in that cold, narrow cell, just as the revolutionaries had claimed. Yet the truth brought no satisfaction. The legend had already grown too large, too rooted in imagination to be undone by evidence. Even now, some believe the substitution theory, that perhaps the heart was not his, that perhaps the real prince escaped into history's blind spot, living and dying under another name. What makes this story endure is not its uncertainty, but its tenderness. The mystery of the lost Dauphin is a mirror held up to human hope, the hope that innocence might survive the cruelty of power, that a child might escape the sins of his parents. In that small, tragic figure, people saw both the end of monarchy and the beginning of something more profound, the recognition that even kings are subject to the fragility of life. The revolution had sought to destroy symbols, but in the process, it created one that would last forever. The image of a boy alone in the dark, representing both the fall of tyranny and the suffering of the innocent. As the candlelight of this tale fades, one can almost hear the echo of footsteps through the temple's stone corridors, the murmur of a lullaby remembered by no one. The story of Louis XVII is both fact and fable, both confirmed and denied. It belongs to that quiet place where history and myth hold hands. Perhaps he died a prisoner. Perhaps he lived a ghost. Either way, his shadow lingers across centuries, a reminder that in every revolution, there are mysteries left unsolved and hearts that continue to beat beneath the rubble of empires. And from this echo of innocence and deceit, our journey moves onward to another queen, another throne, and another web of secrets spun beneath the crown. The air of Tudor England was heavy with the scent of ink, wax, and quiet fear. In the second half of the 16th century, the English court shimmered with beauty and intellect, yet beneath the velvet and ceremony, it was a nest of secrets. At its center stood Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, the daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, a woman who ruled not through brute strength or divine decree, but through an intricate web of wit, caution, and invisible power. Her reign has long been remembered as a golden age, an era of poets and explorers, of music and learning. But gold, as the saying goes, shines brightest when surrounded by darkness. The brilliance of Elizabeth's England was sustained not only by her mind, but by her mastery of secrets, an art that would define her entire life. When Elizabeth took the throne in 1558, England was a country trembling at the edge of ruin. The land had been torn by religious strife, divided between Catholics and Protestants, between loyalty to the Pope and loyalty to the crown. Her predecessor, Mary I, had ruled with fire and faith, leaving behind a nation scorched by persecution. Now, a young queen, unmarried and uncertain, inherited not only the throne but a fractured soul of a kingdom. To survive, she would need not just advisors and soldiers, but eyes and ears in every corridor of power. Thus began one of the most sophisticated spy networks in early modern Europe, a web so complex and secret that its threads are still being uncovered today. At the heart of this unseen empire was Sir Francis Walsingham, Elizabeth's most trusted spy master, a man of quiet purpose and unwavering loyalty. Where others saw politics, Walsingham saw patterns, whispers, and danger hiding in plain sight. He built a network of informants that stretched from London taverns to the courts of Europe. Through coded letters, invisible ink, and intercepted messages, he fed the Queen the lifeblood of power, information. He understood that survival in an age of betrayal depended not on armies, but on anticipation. While her enemies plotted in candlelit rooms, Elizabeth already knew their intentions, sometimes before they did. Walsingham's brilliance lay in his restraint. He was not a man of theatrics, but of patience. Letters were opened, copied, resealed, and delivered without suspicion. His agents, poets, merchants, courtiers, even actors, slipped between identities as easily as a shadow crosses a wall. His most significant victory came in the unmasking of the Babington plot, a conspiracy to assassinate Elizabeth and place her cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots, on the English throne. The plan had been born of faith and desperation, nurtured by those who believed England must return to the Catholic fold. Yet every letter sent between the conspirators passed through Walsingham's hands. The trap was set with meticulous care, each message decoded, each reply allowed to travel just far enough to confirm guilt. Mary Stuart, once a queen in her own right, became the symbol of threat and tragedy intertwined. She was everything Elizabeth could not afford to be, openly passionate, devoutly Catholic, and supported by foreign powers eager to unseat England's Protestant ruler. For nearly 2 decades, she lived under watch, writing letters that she believed were safely hidden, sending words of hope to those who plotted for her release. But her correspondence was her undoing. Walsingham's cryptographers broke her ciphers, revealing her secret consent to Elizabeth's assassination. When the truth emerged, it was as though the earth itself had shifted. Mary, the rival queen, was tried and executed, her death both a warning and a lament. Elizabeth's reaction was complex, almost poetic in its restraint. She had signed the warrant reluctantly, and when Mary's death was carried out, she retreated into isolation, reportedly struck by grief and guilt. Yet she also knew what the act meant. The blood of one queen had secured the life of another, and in that exchange, the foundation of her rule was strengthened. To the world, Elizabeth appeared serene, the embodiment of control and grace, but those closest to her saw the toll of constant vigilance. Her trust was selective, her emotions guarded, her affection tempered by caution. Even love, for her, was a kind of strategy. The world beyond England's shores was just as treacherous. Foreign ambassadors watched the Queen's every move, sending coded reports back to their masters in Spain and France. Pirates were secretly employed as privateers, waging war in the name of commerce while the crown feigned innocence. Each alliance Elizabeth made was balanced upon the knife's edge of deception. Her words could charm a kingdom one moment and silence it the next. She had learned from her father's brutality and her mother's downfall that power, to endure, must be disguised in elegance. And so she ruled not as a conqueror, but as a conductor of human frailty, orchestrating loyalty and fear with the same delicate hand. Even her image was a kind of mask. The portraits of Elizabeth, radiant, ageless, and composed, were crafted as instruments of myth. Every pearl on her gown symbolized purity, every sunburst behind her face divine authority. The real woman, aging and burdened, existed somewhere behind the layers of paint and fabric. To her subjects, she was the eternal maiden, untouched by time or sin. But to those within her circle, she was something greater, a sovereign who had turned her very humanity into a weapon of power. The Virgin Queen was not simply celibate by choice. She was untouchable by design, free from any man's claim, her body and soul belonging entirely to the realm. The quiet brilliance of her reign lay in her understanding that knowledge was control. Where others saw gossip, she saw intelligence. A careless word at court might seal a man's fate. Courtiers learned to smile cautiously, to measure every gesture, for the palace was no longer merely a stage. It was an invisible battlefield. There were no open rebellions, no grand coups, only whispers carried through corridors, coded glances, and letters burned before dawn. Through this quiet vigilance, Elizabeth transformed survival into an art form. When her enemies abroad gathered under banners of faith and conquest, she responded not with armies, but with manipulation. She played Catholic powers against each other, feeding them misinformation through her ambassadors, ensuring no single rival could unite against her. Even her negotiations for marriage, to princes of France, of Austria, of Spain, were often little more than performances, diplomatic illusions meant to buy time or secure favor. Elizabeth had turned courtship into politics and secrecy into governance. By the time her reign neared its end, the web she had woven spanned continents and generations. Her spies had outlived their missions. Her secrets outlasted their tellers. What began as a fragile effort to protect her crown became the foundation of modern intelligence. The calm face of her monarchy concealed a restless machinery of observation and deceit. Yet even now, centuries later, historians debate where truth ends and strategy begins. Was Elizabeth the brilliant tactician who mastered survival, or a woman haunted by the very deception she created? As the candles burn low in the great halls of her memory, the question lingers. The Virgin Queen stands alone, radiant in history's light, yet surrounded by shadows of her own making. The spies who serve her vanish into the background, their names fading with time, but their legacy remains, a reminder that sometimes the greatest acts of loyalty are performed in silence, and that even the most luminous reigns depend on darkness to survive. From the whispers of Tudor England, our path now turns south toward the marble courts of Florence, where beauty itself became a mask for conspiracy, and every smile hid a blade. In the heart of Renaissance Florence, where marble palaces gleamed under the Tuscan sun and church bells sang to the rhythm of ambition, beauty and danger were indistinguishable. The city was a jewel of art and intellect, its streets alive with painters, poets, and philosophers. Yet behind the delicate brushstrokes of Botticelli and the serene faces of angels in frescoes, there pulsed a quieter, darker current, one of envy, manipulation, and calculated deceit. Florence, for all its brilliance, was also a city of masks. And no family wore theirs more elegantly or more dangerously than the Medici. The Medici were not born of power. They built it layer by layer, coin by coin. From their beginnings as bankers, they rose to become the architects of an empire of influence, one that would span generations and weave itself into the very fabric of European politics. Money gave them leverage, but it was secrecy that gave them survival. They understood what few others did. That control did not come from armies or laws, but from the quiet ownership of information, knowing who owed what, who desired whom, who could be bought, and who must disappear. In the golden light of Florence, the Medici learned to rule not through fear, but through the artful orchestration of whispers. At the height of their power stood Lorenzo de' Medici, Lorenzo the Magnificent, patron of the arts, poet, philosopher, and master of the invisible game. Under his hand, Florence became a cradle of genius. He nurtured minds like Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo, treating art not as luxury, but as legacy. Yet for all his refinement, Lorenzo lived surrounded by danger. The Medici wealth had bred envy among rival families, and Florence was never a city easily tamed. Among the most resentful were the Pazzi, an ancient and proud clan whose ambition matched the Medici's own. In the spring of 1478, their rivalry erupted in one of the most shocking conspiracies of the Renaissance. The plot was elegant in design and ruthless in intent. The assassination of Lorenzo and his brother Giuliano during Easter Mass at the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore. Beneath the soaring dome designed by Brunelleschi, the conspirators waited, daggers hidden beneath their robes. The church was filled with incense, the sound of hymns, and the unsuspecting hum of prayer. When the signal was given, blades flashed. Giuliano fell beneath a flurry of stabs, his blood staining the marble floor. Lorenzo, wounded, managed to escape, his hand slashed, but his will unbroken. In that moment, the cathedral, a symbol of divine grace, became the stage of human treachery. The aftermath was swift and merciless. The conspirators were hunted through the city, dragged from hiding, and executed in the very streets where they had once walked in pride. Florence trembled with vengeance. But behind the fury of the crowd was a colder, more deliberate calculation. Lorenzo understood that power, once threatened, must not only be restored but displayed. He turned the failed plot into a spectacle, a message to every rival that the Medici were not merely survivors but orchestrators of fate itself. Even his forgiveness, when it came, was strategic, a carefully measured act that turned enemies into indebted allies. From that day, Lorenzo ruled not just with wealth, but with awe. Yet the legacy of the Medici was far from simple. Their strength lay in subtlety, in poisons disguised as gifts, in letters written in code, in marriages arranged to bind families that might otherwise have rebelled. They funded artists and scholars, but they also funded assassinations and wars. The beauty of Florence, that dream of marble and music, was sustained by acts too quiet and cruel to be recorded in the open. A cup of wine could be a treaty or a death sentence. A smile across the table could conceal an ultimatum. The Medici knew that control required more than fear. It required faith, or at least the illusion of it. They gave the people festivals, pageants, and art, offering splendor as distraction. Beneath frescoed ceilings, politics moved like smoke, invisible yet suffocating. The church itself became an ally and a pawn, for the Medici were not only princes of Florence, they were also patrons of the papacy. When Giovanni de' Medici ascended the throne of St. Peter as Pope Leo X, the family's reach stretched beyond the city's walls into the heart of Christendom. Florence's bankers had become God's treasurers, but even holiness under the Medici came with a price. Their influence shaped the Renaissance and scarred it in equal measure. The same hands that built cathedrals also signed death warrants. The same minds that funded art also engineered the quiet removal of threats. Poison was their chosen instrument, discreet, reliable, untraceable. Some said it was mixed into perfume or sweetened wine. Others whispered of powders imported from the East, so potent that a single breath could silence a man forever. The Medici's enemies did not fall in battle. They simply vanished, leaving behind the illusion of natural misfortune. Yet amid the darkness, there was an undeniable brilliance. The Medici transformed Florence into the beating heart of a cultural revolution. They believed, perhaps sincerely, that art could immortalize their rule, that beauty could cleanse ambition of its sins. Their patronage gave the world Botticelli's ethereal Venus, the first sketches of Da Vinci's machines, and the dome that still crowns the Florentine skyline. Each masterpiece bore the quiet signature of power, not just a tribute to divinity, but to the family who made such divinity possible. And perhaps that was their truest conspiracy of all. Not the assassinations or the political intrigues, but the rewriting of memory itself. The Medici understood how easily the world forgives what it finds beautiful. The horrors of their politics were softened by the radiance of their legacy. History, like art, is an act of illusion. What is painted brightly enough can obscure what lies beneath. Even centuries later, the name Medici conjures images of marble halls and oil-painted glory, not the trembling victims who drank from gilded cups or the courtiers who vanished after midnight. As the sun set over Florence, its golden light stretching across the Arno, the city's beauty seemed eternal, untouched by human deceit. But within those palaces, the true machinery of the Renaissance turned in silence. Letters exchanged under candlelight, secrets traded for loyalty, love used as leverage. In this city of splendor, the Medici reigned as both patrons and puppeteers, their empire woven from silk and shadows alike. And as Florence slept, lulled by the sound of church bells, its rulers continued their quiet game, ensuring that the art of conspiracy would survive long after their names had become legend. For in the Medici world, truth itself was a canvas, to be painted, perfected, and hidden beneath layers of gold. From the marble glow of Italy, our path now drifts toward reflection, into the space between beauty and deceit, a place where lies were not shouted, but whispered with grace, and where silence became the most elegant weapon of all. Every kingdom begins with a promise and survives on a lie. Between the gleaming crowns and the dim corridors of history, there runs a fragile thread, the art of deception refined into a necessity. After the Medici's Florence fades into silence, we are left with a question that hangs in the air like candle smoke. What makes a royal lie so powerful that it outlives the truth? In the hush that follows every act of betrayal, in the calm between revolutions and restorations, there exists a strange kind of order, a delicate balance between illusion and belief. This is the anatomy of a royal lie. Not a single falsehood whispered in fear, but a structure carefully built to sustain power itself. Deception at the royal level is rarely spontaneous. It is not the desperate lie of survival, but a performance, slow, deliberate, and exquisitely planned. Monarchs throughout history have understood that truth, in its pure form, is too dangerous to rule with. Truth breeds rebellion. Illusion breeds stability. To keep subjects obedient, kings and queens learned to craft the stories that would define them. They wove tales of divine right, of chosen destiny, of miracles seen in the stars or the battlefield. These fictions, once repeated often enough, became sacred. A lie spoken in a crown's voice ceased to sound like deceit. It became the law of the world beneath it. In this twilight between honesty and strategy, even silence becomes a tool. The greatest rulers were not always those who spoke the most, but those who let rumor do their work for them. A single raised eyebrow, a pause in a sentence, could shift the fate of a minister or start a war. Courtiers learned to read not the words of their sovereigns, but the spaces between them. The royal court was a theater of suggestion, where truth was performed, not confessed. What was said openly mattered less than what was implied in whispers. And those whispers, subtle, uncertain, impossible to trace, became the bloodstream of governance. To understand this, one must remember that monarchy itself is a contradiction. It claims divine authority, yet depends entirely on human frailty. It projects stability while living in constant fear of collapse. And so, to survive, rulers learned to build worlds of illusion, not just in politics, but in faith, in ritual, even in art. The crown was both symbol and disguise, a shining promise that the person beneath it could never fully fulfill. It was easier, perhaps, to let the crown itself lie, to let it carry the burden of perfection that no human could sustain. In this way, every lie became a form of devotion, every deception a kind of prayer for continuity. And yet, there is something strangely tender about these falsehoods. They were not always cruel. Many were born from a desire to preserve harmony, to shield the people from chaos. When a king concealed his weakness, he did so to protect the illusion that the realm was safe. When a queen smiled at court despite heartbreak, it was not vanity, but duty. Their deception was not always self-serving. It was sometimes an act of love, love for a nation that needed to believe in stability more than it needed to know the truth. The burden of monarchy, in this sense, was to lie beautifully, to maintain the illusion of permanence in a world built on impermanence. But beauty, like truth, has its cost. Every royal lie, no matter how skillful, demanded a sacrifice. Some rulers lost their humanity in maintaining their image. Others lost their lives when the mask cracked. The very tools that secured their power also hollowed them from within. The longer one plays a role, the more the role becomes reality, and the self beneath it disappears. To live as a monarch was to exist in two worlds, the public and the secret, the divine and the damned. Over time, even the liars began to forget where the lie ended and where they began. History, in its gentle cruelty, remembers both their triumphs and their delusions without distinction. If one listens closely to the rhythm of time, these lies can still be heard. In the careful wording of proclamations, in the grand portraits that soften imperfections, in the carefully edited histories written by royal scribes. These were the instruments of deception that shaped centuries. A painter might erase a scar, a historian might omit a scandal, a priest might sanctify a rumor. Together, they built a kingdom not of stone, but of story. And as long as people believed the story, the crown remained untarnished. There were, of course, moments when the fabric tore, when truth forced its way through. The French Revolution was one such moment, a collective unmasking, a violent reckoning with centuries of royal deceit. Yet even that rebellion, born of rage and righteousness, created myths of its own. For every truth revealed, another was invented. Perhaps this is the unspoken lesson of power, that even in its destruction, illusion persists. The human heart prefers narrative to chaos, and so it builds new lies to replace the old. When we look back now, with the calm of distance, the royal lie no longer feels like a crime. It feels like an inevitability. To govern is to shape perception, and to shape perception is to manipulate truth. The thrones of the world were never built solely of marble and gold. They were built of belief. Belief that the ruler was chosen, that destiny favored them, that the order of things was unchangeable. And belief, fragile though it may be, is sustained not by evidence, but by story. In that sense, every monarch was both sovereign and storyteller, spinning tales not to deceive, but to survive. As night falls over this reflection, we see how each of the great conspiracies, from Florence to England, from Paris to Rome, began with the same foundation, a story told in half-truths, shaped by necessity. Lies became laws, and secrets became the scaffolding of nations. Yet, in their quiet deceit, these rulers revealed something deeply human. They feared loss, they feared disorder, they feared being forgotten. And so they built illusions strong enough to outlast their own mortality. The candles burn low, and we are left with a faint glow of understanding. A royal lie is not a mere falsehood. It is an instrument of balance, a bridge between chaos and control. Empires have risen and fallen upon it. The truth, when it finally emerges, does not destroy the lie. It completes it, showing us the full shape of history's design. The time for reflection ends, and now the path turns once more to the north, toward frozen palaces and restless thrones, where love, ambition, and betrayal will blur again into the same quiet music of survival. The Russian winter has always held a strange kind of silence, a silence that feels alive, like the earth itself is listening. Through that vast and frozen stillness, the story of an emperor's disappearance has echoed for more than 2 centuries. It begins in glittering palaces, beneath chandeliers heavy with crystal, and ends in the half-light of conspiracy and rumor. The man at its center was Peter III, the ill-fated husband of Catherine the Great, a ruler whose short reign, remains one of history's most debated enigmas. His death, or perhaps his survival, became one of the Russian Empire's most haunting mysteries, a question suspended between truth and shadow. Peter III ascended the throne in 1762, inheriting a nation vast beyond comprehension, a patchwork of frozen fields and ancient loyalties. Yet his crown sat uneasily upon his head. He was German by birth, awkward in manner, and out of step with the soul of his adopted land. Where Russia prized strength and solemnity, Peter admired the discipline of Prussia. He adored Frederick the Great, even as Russia's armies fought against him. He spoke with the wrong accent, loved foreign customs, and trusted men his nobles despised. From the beginning, his rule seemed a mistake that everyone could see, but no one dared to name aloud. Catherine, his wife, was everything he was not: intelligent, composed, and quietly ambitious. She had studied philosophy in secret, read the works of Voltaire by candlelight, and understood the pulse of power better than anyone at court. While Peter alienated the nobility with his reckless reforms and childish arrogance, Catherine listened. She watched. She waited. It was said that she could walk through a room without saying a word and still make every man there feel her presence. She knew, perhaps long before anyone else, that her husband's downfall was inevitable. In the summer of 1762, after only 6 months on the throne, Peter's fate was sealed. While he played at war games and drafted proclamations no one respected, his wife moved with silent precision. She gathered allies, generals, ministers, and members of the elite guard. Promises were whispered in darkened corridors. Loyalty was bought with titles and favors. When the coup began, it unfolded with eerie calm. Catherine rode out before the troops, dressed in green and gold, her composure unshakable. The soldiers, weary of Peter's eccentricities, knelt before her. Within hours, the empire had changed hands. Catherine was declared empress, and Peter was taken into custody. What happened next remains a riddle. Official accounts claim that Peter was sent to Ropsha, a remote estate outside St. Petersburg, where he died only days later of hemorrhoidal colic, a diagnosis so absurd it was almost an admission of guilt. Rumors spread instantly that he had been strangled during a drunken brawl, that poison had been used, that Catherine herself had ordered his death to secure her throne. Others whispered that he had escaped, disguised as a commoner, living for years in secret under the name Fyodor, a wandering monk who appeared mysteriously in distant villages, preaching forgiveness and peace. The people called him the Phantom Emperor. Catherine's silence on the matter was as telling as any confession. She never spoke Peter's name again in public. Her reign, long and brilliant, would come to define an era, an age of reform, culture, and imperial expansion. Yet beneath the grandeur, a quiet unease persisted. It was said that she kept a portrait of Peter locked away, that she dreamed of him in the long, cold nights, that guilt shadowed her triumph like a ghost walking the corridors of the Winter Palace. The empress who could command armies could not command the past. The mystery of Peter's death only deepened as the decades passed. Every few years, a new claimant appeared. A monk, a farmer, a soldier, each insisting he was the lost emperor returned. One of the most famous, Yemelian Pugachev, led a massive peasant rebellion in the 1770s, proclaiming himself Peter III resurrected. His followers, desperate for justice and for a savior to challenge Catherine's rule, believed him with a fervor that shook the empire. Whether he truly believed his own claim or merely used it as a weapon is uncertain, but the rebellion proved that even a dead emperor could still command an army. What makes Peter's story so compelling is not simply the question of whether he lived or died, but what his fate revealed about the world he left behind. Russia, vast and layered with superstition, has always blurred the line between reality and myth. To the people, the idea of an emperor wronged and hidden away spoke to something deeper, a belief that power, once divine, could never truly be extinguished. In the quiet of the Russian countryside, they whispered that Peter would return one day, riding through the snow to reclaim his throne. It was not loyalty to the man they preserved, but to the story itself, a story of justice deferred, of truth buried beneath the ice. Catherine, for all her brilliance, could never entirely escape that story. Her achievements, the flourishing of art, the modernization of the state, the expansion of empire, all carried the faint scent of conspiracy. Her enemies called her usurper, her admirers genius. Perhaps she was both. Perhaps her greatness could only have existed in the vacuum left by Peter's fall. History, after all, does not measure morality. It measures success. And Catherine succeeded beyond measure. Yet, the shadow of that one act, that quiet disappearance, never left her. In the private letters of her later years, between discussions of philosophy and governance, there are subtle pauses, hints of melancholy. She wrote often about guilt and destiny, about the burden of those who rule. Some have wondered whether, in those lines, she was speaking not of her empire but of the ghost she had inherited with her crown. To this day, historians debate the truth. Was Peter murdered by his captors, or did he die of illness? Was Catherine complicit, or merely a beneficiary of the chaos that followed? The evidence is fragmentary, contradictory, deliberately obscured. The imperial archives, rich with records of everything from military campaigns to dinner menus, offer almost nothing about that crucial summer. It is as though the empire itself agreed to forget. But the people never did. Even now, in the half-frozen villages and quiet monasteries of Russia, the legend persists that the emperor who vanished into the cold might still wander somewhere between history and eternity. The tale is retold like a lullaby, soft and mournful, about power taken and innocence undone. And so, the story of Peter III lingers, not as a tale of crime or justice, but as a reminder of how fragile the crown truly is. In every palace, there are doors that remain locked, portraits that turn their eyes away, and silences that speak louder than any proclamation. The empress's empire endures in the pages of history, but the emperor's ghost endures in its imagination. Between them lies the frozen breath of mystery, still visible in the cold air of Russia's past. From these icy shadows, our journey moves south once more, from the power of empire to the loneliness of one who wore its crown, to a story where beauty and sorrow are inseparable, and where the weight of royalty becomes the heaviest burden of all. The story of Catherine the Great begins where Peter's ends, in the quiet aftermath of his disappearance, when the Russian Empire found itself ruled by a woman both admired and feared. She had risen from obscurity, from the minor nobility of Prussia, to become the most powerful woman in the world. Yet for all her grandeur, Catherine lived in a cage of perception, adored by philosophers, mistrusted by courtiers, and endlessly mythologized by history. Her reign was long and radiant, but beneath its brilliance lay secrets as heavy as the empire she ruled. She was called enlightened, ruthless, visionary, immoral, 1,000 faces crafted by those who could never truly know her. And behind them all was the woman herself, more complex than any legend, quietly aware that power and loneliness are always bound together. When Catherine seized the throne in 1762, she did so with the calm precision of someone who had spent her entire life preparing for that moment. Her first words as empress were not a declaration of victory, but of service. To Russia, she said, to its people and its destiny. It was a clever choice, for she knew the danger of appearing as a usurper. She needed legitimacy, and legitimacy, like loyalty, could be built through stories. So Catherine began to write one of her own, a narrative of transformation, of divine purpose, of renewal. She would present herself not as a thief of crowns, but as the rightful guardian of a broken empire. Her rule became a paradox of vision and control. Outwardly, she was the embodiment of the Enlightenment. She corresponded with Voltaire and Diderot, embraced science, and imagined herself as a philosopher queen. She reformed education, expanded trade, and modernized the legal code. She spoke of reason and progress, of justice and equality, words that echoed like sunlight through the marble corridors of St. Petersburg. Yet behind the words, her reign was built on the same foundations as all monarchies before it: surveillance, manipulation, and fear. For Catherine understood that enlightenment without order was chaos, and that ideals were useful only so long as they did not threaten her throne. Her court became a theater of contradictions, an empire of intellect draped in silk and shadows. Diplomats praised her charm, artists adored her generosity, and lovers worshipped her brilliance. But loyalty in the Winter Palace was never unconditional. It was a performance measured in proximity and privilege. Each evening, as the chandeliers were lit and the music began, the dance of intrigue resumed. Ministers whispered behind fans, alliances shifted in glances, and Catherine, poised, smiling, unshakable, observed it all with the precision of a chess player. Among the courtiers, the most powerful were not always the noblemen, but the favorites, the chosen companions whose affection she rewarded with land, titles, and influence. They were part lovers, part confidants, part pawns. The most famous among them was Grigory Potemkin, a man as ambitious as she was intelligent, as brilliant as he was flawed. Together, they ruled not as monarch and servant, but as partners in empire. It was said that they shared not just passion but vision, a dream of Russia as a modern, unstoppable force stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Their correspondence, filled with tenderness and strategy, remains one of the most revealing windows into Catherine's mind. Through it, we see not the cold ruler of legend, but a woman who yearned for understanding, for companionship, for love untainted by politics. Yet even love, under a crown, becomes strategy. Catherine knew that to survive in a world dominated by men, she had to master the very weapons they used: charm, calculation, and the art of concealment. Her femininity became both her armor and her disguise. When her enemies mocked her for her lovers, she turned scandal into strength, making her autonomy itself a form of power. She understood that gossip, like fear, could be controlled if embraced rather than denied. The Empress became untouchable not by hiding her flaws, but by owning them. Still, power came at cost. Catherine's paranoia grew with each passing year. She saw betrayal everywhere, in advisors who hesitated too long before answering, in generals who returned from campaigns too proud of their victories. The memory of how she had gained the throne haunted her, for she knew how easily it could be taken. Every letter from abroad was read twice, every whisper weighed. She expanded her network of spies, ensuring that nothing within the empire escaped her notice. Yet, despite this vigilance, she could never silence the most persistent rumor of all, that Peter, the husband she had dethroned, still lived somewhere in exile. The myth lingered like frost, and though she dismissed it publicly, some say she had nightmares of his return. Beyond the palace walls, her empire grew restless. The Pugachev rebellion, led by the impostor claiming to be Peter III, nearly shattered her illusion of control. The uprising spread through the countryside like wildfire, fed by poverty and rage. It forced Catherine to confront the limits of her Enlightenment ideals. She crushed the rebellion with brutal efficiency, and when the false Peter was captured, he was executed publicly as a warning. The Empress, who had once spoken of reason and mercy, now ruled through the oldest language of power, fear. And though her authority was restored, something in her shifted. She no longer spoke as often of reform or justice. Instead, she turned her gaze outward to conquest, expansion, and legacy. In her later years, Catherine became both creator and curator of her own myth. She commissioned portraits that depicted her as Minerva, as mother of a nation, as bringer of light. The walls of her palaces glittered with symbols of victory and virtue, each one a story carefully crafted to outshine the truth. Yet behind these painted images was a woman who often wrote of weariness. In her journals, she confessed to loneliness, a loneliness not of absence, but of excess. She had everything a ruler could desire, and yet she remained surrounded by masks. Every smile offered to her was tinged with calculation. Every declaration of loyalty could be a lie. She ruled a world that reflected her perfectly, radiant on the surface, turbulent beneath. Catherine's death in 1796 was as sudden as her rise. The empire mourned, though few truly knew the woman they buried. History remembers her as the great conqueror, modernizer, visionary, but the shadows of her reign endure. The mystery of Peter's end, the silence of those who vanished at court, the glittering web of deception that sustained her rule, all remain part of her legacy. She had built an empire of brilliance, but also one of masks, and in doing so, she ensured that her story would forever be told through a haze of fascination and doubt. Even now, her presence lingers in the halls of the Hermitage, in the vast libraries she filled, in the art that she collected to immortalize her name. To some, she is the embodiment of female power. To others, a symbol of ambition's cost. Perhaps both are true. For Catherine understood what so many rulers before and after her learned too late. That power is never possessed, only borrowed, and that its price is always solitude. As the snow settles once more over St. Petersburg, one can almost imagine her spirit wandering the corridors of the Winter Palace, listening to the faint echo of her own footsteps, an empress searching not for dominion, but for the peace she never found in life. And from that quiet, the story turns westward again, toward another kingdom, another crown, where deceit was dressed in velvet and destiny disguised itself as duty. In the soft mist of the English dawn, where the Thames drifts like a ribbon of memory beneath the bridges of London, another tale of power and secrecy begins. The air hums with the echoes of whispers once spoken in candlelit halls, of footsteps gliding across marble floors in the royal palaces of the Tudors. Here, within the stone walls of Hampton Court and the shadowed corridors of Whitehall, the destiny of a nation was rewritten by one woman's defiance in Boleyn. Her name, centuries later, still trembles with fascination and unease. Was she a seductress or a scapegoat, a manipulator or a martyr? The answer, like the crown she sought, remains elusive, half truth, half legend. Before and there was a king who believed himself chosen by God, and after her, a kingdom that learned how fragile divine favor could be. Henry VIII was, at first, the perfect monarch, handsome, intelligent, and devout. Yet beneath his charm simmered a restless ambition. He wanted not only power, but permanence, not only a dynasty, but immortality. And in the eyes of the court, that immortality required one thing, a son. His marriage to Catherine of Aragon, though politically sound, had brought him only daughters and disappointment. Each failed pregnancy deepened his sense of divine betrayal. And into this hollow came, and bright, daring, and unlike any woman he had ever known. And Boleyn was not born into majesty, but she carried within her a force that reshaped it. Educated in the courts of France, she spoke the language of refinement and strategy. She was neither submissive nor reckless, but something far more dangerous, self-aware. When she returned to England, she became the mirror in which Henry saw both his desire and his destiny. She refused his advances with the grace of a queen, not the eagerness of a mistress. It was that refusal that ensnared him completely. The king who had ruled men with ease found himself ruled, instead, by longing. As their courtship unfolded, it was not merely a romance, but a revolution. Anne's influence grew in whispers and gestures, a look held too long, a sentence left unfinished. She became the heartbeat of the court, the subject of every rumor and the spark of every rivalry. Yet behind the allure was calculation. She was not naive. She knew that proximity to power was perilous. Each step closer to the throne brought her deeper into a labyrinth of expectation and danger. But ambition, once awakened, is rarely silenced. When Henry declared that his conscience forbade him to remain married to Catherine, Anne's path was sealed. What followed was one of the most extraordinary acts of defiance in English history. The king broke from Rome, defying the Pope and centuries of religious order, all for the right to marry her. Monasteries fell, the church trembled, and England's spiritual landscape was torn apart, not by war, but by love and obsession. For a time, and stood beside him in triumph. She was crowned in 1533, radiant beneath a crown that seemed too heavy for her delicate frame. The people watched in silence, some with awe, others with doubt. The coronation was grand, yet in the shadows, old loyalties to Catherine burned like embers waiting to ignite. But power in Tudor England was as fleeting as affection. The same intensity that had lifted into glory soon began to turn against her. Henry's passion cooled into impatience, and whispers began to circle like vultures. She had failed to give him a son, producing only a daughter, the future Elizabeth I, though no one yet could imagine her greatness. The court, always eager to align itself with the rising sun, began to distance itself from the queen. Enemies who had once bowed before her now plotted her downfall. The old alliances reformed, quietly, beneath her very nose. And sensed it coming. The music at court seemed more hollow, the smiles more strained. She had built her reign on the twin pillars of love and persuasion, but both were eroding. The king's eyes had turned elsewhere, to Jane Seymour, gentle, compliant, everything and refused to be. When the end came, it came swiftly, wrapped in the language of law but driven by vengeance. She was accused of adultery, incest, and treason, charges so grotesque that their very absurdity revealed the truth. Her real crime was no longer being loved. The trial was a performance, and everyone in the audience knew the script. The evidence was fabricated, the witnesses coerced, the outcome predetermined. Yet, and stood in the courtroom with remarkable composure. Her voice, steady and clear, carried through the hall as she denied each accusation. Those who saw her that day later said she seemed almost luminous, as if she had already transcended the fear of death. Her final words were not curses but prayers, for the king, for England, and for forgiveness. On the morning of her execution, she dressed in gray damask, her hair bound in a simple cap. She knelt before the French swordsman brought for the occasion, and in that final moment, lifted her eyes to the sky. One stroke, they said, and it was done. Yet her death did not silence her story. In fact, it began it. Within a generation, her daughter Elizabeth would rule England with unmatched brilliance, embodying the very strength and grace her mother had been condemned for. History, in its quiet irony, restored and through the legacy of her child. The queen who died accused of betrayal gave birth to the monarch who would define an age. Anne's ghost lingers still, not as a restless spirit, but as a symbol. She represents the peril of ambition in a world that punished women for it, and the tragedy of love when it becomes entangled with power. Her story endures because it captures the eternal tension between heart and throne, between devotion and survival. She was both victim and architect, both sinner and saint, and perhaps that is why she cannot be forgotten. Even now, in the hushed chambers of the Tower of London, where her footsteps once echoed, the air feels charged with her memory. Visitors speak of a strange stillness near the chapel where she is buried, as if the past itself is holding its breath. On some nights, they say, a figure in gray is seen walking along the battlements, head bowed, her presence as calm as the night itself. Not haunting, but remembering. And so, Boleyn's story becomes not just a tale of betrayal, but of transformation, the quiet alchemy through which tragedy becomes legend. She did not simply lose her crown. She became it, immortalized in the very fabric of England's identity. In her fall, she revealed the dangerous beauty of power and the way it consumes those who dare to touch it. As the fog thickens over the river and the bells of London toll softly in the distance, her story fades into the next. Another court, another betrayal, another empire shaped by the fragile line between truth and illusion. The stage shifts, but the pattern remains. Love turned to strategy, devotion turned to danger. And in that endless cycle, the world keeps spinning, silently ruled by the ghosts of its own secrets. The Tudor age, so gilded in memory, was in truth an era of unease. After the death of Anne Boleyn, the English court moved through years of turbulence, its faith and loyalty bending like reeds before the wind. Henry VIII would marry again and again, seeking solace in new faces, but never escaping the shadow of what his ambition had done. And when his reign finally ended, it left behind more than a kingdom. It left a legacy of suspicion, a sense that behind every crown there lingered a hidden hand. By the time Elizabeth I ascended the throne, England was weary of blood and betrayal. Yet peace, for all her brilliance, would not come easily. The crown she wore was heavy not only with jewels, but with ghosts. Elizabeth was a child of scandal, born from a marriage that had defied the Pope and shattered the Church. Many doubted her right to rule. Others saw her as the living reminder of her mother's supposed sins. She grew up in the shadow of danger, learning early the art of concealment. Every word she spoke, every gesture she made, was weighed, measured, interpreted. From such a childhood was forged the queen who would one day become legend. She understood better than anyone that survival in a world of men required not brute force, but subtlety, the kind that whispers instead of shouts, that hides intent behind smile. When she became queen in 1558, the world watched with skepticism. Europe's monarchs saw her as a young, untested woman ruling a divided nation. Her own court was filled with factions, Protestants and Catholics, loyalists and opportunists, all waiting to see which side she would favor. Yet Elizabeth, calm as ever, turned doubt into her strongest weapon. She became a master of balance, holding her realm together with poise and ambiguity. Her words were poetry and diplomacy intertwined. Her silences spoke louder than decrees. To her subjects, she was the virgin queen, devoted only to England. To her enemies, she was the cunning daughter of a condemned woman, weaving her mother's lessons into her reign. But within her court, even beauty and brilliance could not erase danger. The Tudor world was one of hidden plots and whispered treason, of coded letters and unseen knives. Espionage had become the heartbeat of the age. Under Elizabeth, it reached new heights of sophistication, a web of spies and informants stretching across Europe, all bound by fear and loyalty. At the center of this web stood a man whose name would echo through centuries of intrigue, Sir Francis Walsingham. To the world, he was the Queen's secretary. To those who lived in the shadows, he was her unseen shield, her invisible hand of judgment. Walsingham understood what few dared to say aloud, that Elizabeth's reign depended not on love or law, but on vigilance. He built a network so intricate that no plot could escape it for long. Couriers were intercepted, letters were steamed open and resealed, and secret codes were broken with terrifying precision. Through his agents, he turned the enemy's own whispers into weapons. Yet his methods were as ruthless as they were effective. Torture chambers hummed beneath London's surface. Traitors vanished without trial. Confessions were extracted in the name of survival. Walsingham believed that in the game of empires, mercy was a luxury England could not afford. The greatest threat to Elizabeth's rule came not from her borders, but from her own blood. Her cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots. Exiled and imprisoned in England, Mary represented everything Elizabeth was not: openly Catholic, romantic, impulsive, and dangerously magnetic. To her supporters, she was the rightful heir, the true queen unjustly caged. To Elizabeth, she was a living spark that could ignite rebellion at any moment. Their relationship was a tapestry of kinship and rivalry, affection and fear. Letters passed between them, courteous on the surface but heavy with subtext. Elizabeth could not kill her cousin without appearing monstrous. She could not free her without courting disaster. For nearly 2 decades, the two queens circled each other like reflections in a mirror. Mary plotted, or was accused of plotting. Elizabeth hesitated, hoping for a peace that never came. Then, in 1586, came the Babington Plot, a conspiracy uncovered by Walsingham spies, in which Mary was implicated through intercepted letters. Whether she truly consented to the plan to assassinate Elizabeth remains uncertain, but the evidence, manufactured or not, was enough. The court demanded her death. The Queen resisted, knowing the stain such an act would leave upon her soul. But power, once seized, is never entirely one's own. Parliament pressed, advisers urged, and finally, Elizabeth signed the warrant. Mary was executed in February 1587. Those who witnessed it said she met death with grace, dressed in crimson beneath her black cloak, the color of martyrdom. When the axe fell, the crowd wept, not only for her, but for the world that had been lost in the clash of faith and power. Elizabeth, when told the deed was done, locked herself in her chamber for days. She wept, raged, and claimed she had never intended the order to be carried out. Whether that was truth or theater, no one could say. But in that moment, the Virgin Queen became a haunted one. She had removed her greatest rival, but in doing so, she had confirmed the prophecy that power devours all tenderness. From then on, Elizabeth's reign took on the stillness of self-control perfected. Her laughter was rarer, her solitude deeper. She turned her focus to the image she would leave behind. Painters immortalized her in jewels and lace, symbols of purity and might. Poets compared her to goddesses, angels, and suns. Yet those who saw her in her final years spoke of melancholy behind the majesty. She had loved and lost, trusted and been betrayed. She had survived wars, plots, and heartbreak, but in doing so, she had built her throne on isolation. Her image became her armor, and within that shining illusion, she hid a woman who longed simply to be seen not as sovereign, but as human. The court, too, changed with her. Once alive with music and laughter, it grew quiet, cautious. Every courtier knew that misplaced word could destroy a career, that a smile withheld could be fatal. The Virgin Queen had turned her court into a mirror of herself, brilliant, impenetrable, and utterly alone. Yet her loneliness gave her clarity. She saw the truth that so many kings before her had missed. That rule is not domination, but endurance. Her power did not come from heirs or armies, but from a strength to hold her composure when the world demanded she break. By the time she died in 1603, Elizabeth had reigned for 45 years. England stood transformed, stronger, more stable, more confident. But her death also ended the Tudor line, closing a chapter of history written in passion and blood. The secrets of her reign, locked in letters and burned documents, would continue to haunt the empire for centuries. Some say her last words were of her mother, and Bullen, as if, in the final breath, the stories of mother and daughter at last became one. In the silence that followed, England mourned not only its queen, but its own reflection. Elizabeth had embodied the contradictions of her time: light and shadow, wisdom and deceit, strength and sorrow. Her reign proved that even the most brilliant rule is but a fragile illusion, a candle flickering against the wind of history. And as that flame dimmed, another began to glow beyond the sea. In the rising courts of Europe, where the same dance of power, secrecy, and destiny would play out again under different crowns, in new disguises. The stage was ready for the next act of the eternal play, where loyalty and treason would once more entwine like lovers beneath the same uncertain stars. As the echoes of Elizabeth's reign faded into the mists of time, they gave way to a new dynasty, one born from the ashes of the Tudor line, but whose power would span oceans and continents. The Stuart family, under James VI of Scotland, took their place in the English throne as James I of England in 1603. The union of England and Scotland, promised to bring peace and prosperity, instead marked the beginning of a new chapter in royal conspiracies, where intrigue, religious conflict, and ambitions would intertwine in ways that seemed almost destined to erupt. But it was not the crown itself that would prove most dangerous. It was the enemies who lurked in the shadows, eager to exploit weakness and the ever-present tension between monarchy and the people that would set the stage for one of the most famous conspiracies in history, the Gunpowder Plot. James I, who ascended the English throne after the death of Elizabeth, was a man whose reign began with great promise but quickly became entangled in deep religious and political strife. A monarch who ruled two kingdoms, Scotland and England, he faced the daunting task of unifying them, all while managing the volatile currents of Protestant and Catholic tensions. The legacy of Henry VIII's break with Rome was still alive, and even a century later, Catholics in England had yet to accept the Protestant establishment. They yearned for a return to the old ways, and the crown, especially one that had been shaped by Elizabeth's Protestant influence, became the symbol of everything they opposed. As James sat upon his throne, these religious rifts deepened. Though he was born to a Protestant lineage, he believed in religious tolerance. His attempts to find peace between the factions of Protestantism and Catholicism were met with suspicion and resistance, especially from the entrenched Protestant elite who feared his perceived leniency toward Catholicism. In such a climate, the stage was set for something far more deadly than mere discord, a conspiracy to overthrow the throne itself. The Gunpowder Plot of 1605, one of the most infamous plots in English history, would forever change the course of James's reign. The conspiracy, orchestrated by a group of English Catholics, including the infamous Guy Fawkes, was intended to destroy the House of Lords during the state opening of Parliament and, with it, the Protestant monarchy. Their plan was simple but horrifying: to blow up the king, the royal family, and as many of the English nobility as possible. The goal was not only to end James's reign, but to replace him with a Catholic monarch, one who would reverse the Protestant establishment and restore Catholicism to England. Fawkes, tasked with guarding the barrels of gunpowder beneath the House of Lords, became the face of the plot, though the true masterminds behind the scheme were a group of English Catholics who had grown frustrated with their inability to find a way back to favor under James's rule. But the plotters, as with all royal conspiracies, underestimated the depth of surveillance in the court. Tensions had risen, and paranoia had set in among the nobility and the government. The authorities had been aware of the growing unrest among Catholics, and in the midst of their planning, one of the conspirators, aware of the potential for betrayal, sent an anonymous letter to Lord Monteagle, a Catholic peer, warning him to stay away from Parliament that day. This letter, intercepted and passed on to the authorities, marked the beginning of the plot's unraveling. Within days, the gunpowder barrels were discovered, Guy Fawkes was arrested, and the full scale of the conspiracy was revealed. The gunpowder plot failed, but its consequences were far-reaching. The conspirators were executed in gruesome fashion, drawn and quartered in front of a public eager to see the plotters punished for their audacity. Guy Fawkes, once seen as a hero by some of his fellow Catholics, became the face of treason. To this day, his name is synonymous with betrayal and failure, immortalized in the annual Guy Fawkes Night celebrations, where effigies of him are burned in bonfires across England. However, the failure of the gunpowder plot did not quell the flames of dissent or settle the anxieties of a nation torn by religious conflict. Instead, it cemented the idea of the Catholic conspirator in the English psyche, transforming Catholicism from a religious minority to a dangerous, subversive force in the eyes of the state. In the aftermath of the plot, James I's government enacted even stricter laws against Catholics. The once hopeful monarch who had tried to bridge the gap between Protestants and Catholics was now forced into an even tighter embrace of Protestantism. Catholics were persecuted, their rights stripped away. It was a bitter irony. James, who had been raised in the fire of religious persecution, found himself enacting the very policies of exclusion that had been imposed upon his own mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, and that had led to her tragic death at the hands of Elizabeth's regime. But while James's reign was one marked by his growing distrust of the Catholic minority, it was also an era of royal intrigue and foreign alliances, a time when the conspiracies around the monarchy grew ever more complex. In 1625, James I died, passing the crown to his son, Charles I. Charles's reign would be defined by his stubbornness, his belief in the divine right of kings, and the growing tensions between the monarchy and Parliament. As the story of the gunpowder plot became a distant memory, new plots would take shape, but none more dangerous than the civil war that would soon engulf England, leading to the eventual execution of Charles I. In the court of James and his son, the line between loyalty and betrayal remained razor-thin. The conspiracies continued, each one more elaborate and more dangerous than the last. In the end, the failure of the gunpowder plot served as both a warning and a catalyst. It warned of the dangers of underestimating the discontent of the people, but it also catalyzed the forces that would eventually challenge the monarchy itself. The flames of rebellion, once sparked by religious divide, would soon burn even hotter as Parliament and the monarchy battled for control, culminating in a conflict that would tear the kingdom asunder. In the shadows of royal courts, conspiracies grew not only out of ideological beliefs, but out of personal ambition. The rise of the English Civil War, marked by Charles I's belief in his absolute rule, would ultimately create a world where loyalty was as fragile as glass, and betrayal the only constant. The royal bloodlines would continue, but with each passing century, the mysteries that swirled around them would deepen until the very nature of monarchy itself was called into question. And the story of the gunpowder plot, with its ambitions, its betrayals, and its chilling failure, would become yet another tale of how power, once threatened, turns on itself in the end. The history of royal conspiracies would continue to unfold through the ages, its threads reaching into the turbulent heart of Europe. But no tale would quite match the drama, complexity, and devastation of the English Civil War, a war not fought merely between soldiers, but between ideologies, loyalties, and beliefs. As the seeds of rebellion were sown under the reign of Charles I, the monarchy faced a crisis of legitimacy, one that would reshape the very nature of royal power. While the gunpowder plot had been a momentary spark in the larger tapestry of discontent, the civil war that followed was a tempest that would burn through centuries of tradition, leaving a kingdom irreparably altered. Charles I was a man whose belief in the divine right of kings placed him in direct opposition to the growing power of Parliament. He ruled with the conviction that the monarchy was ordained by God, and that as king, he was answerable only to divine authority. His firm belief in this principle, however, would ultimately lead to his undoing. While his vision of absolute monarchy was unyielding, England was changing, and the tides of political power were beginning to shift. Parliament, long held at arm's length, was beginning to grow in influence, driven by a new generation of leaders who sought to challenge the power of the crown. The seeds of civil war had been planted even before Charles ascended to the throne. His father, James I, had also struggled with Parliament, but Charles's rule would mark the point of no return. His attempts to govern without Parliament, coupled with his imposition of taxes without consent, quickly alienated key segments of the population. The imposition of the unpopular Book of Common Prayer in Scotland only further fueled the flames of discontent. His attempts to impose religious uniformity were met with widespread resistance, particularly in Scotland, where a growing Presbyterian movement opposed his policies. As unrest spread across the kingdom, the stage was set for a direct clash between Crown and Parliament. In 1642, the conflict came to a head. Charles, determined to assert his authority, raised his royal standard in Nottingham, calling his supporters to arms. Parliament, not to be outdone, raised its own army, and thus the English Civil War began. It was a war not simply of armies but of ideals. On one side stood the royalists, loyal to the king and the divine right of monarchy. On the other stood the parliamentarians, led by figures such as Oliver Cromwell, who argued for the sovereignty of Parliament and the rights of the people. At its core, the conflict was a struggle for control, not just of the nation's land, but of its soul. The royalists believed that the monarchy was the very heartbeat of England's identity. The parliamentarians, however, saw the king's actions as tyrannical, threatening the very foundation of English freedom. As the war raged on, the tide of battle ebbed and flowed, with neither side able to secure a decisive victory. Yet behind the battles lay the brewing tension between the monarchy and its subjects, a tension that, at times, seemed to verge on paranoia. Charles's refusal to compromise with Parliament deepened the divide. His own actions, the dissolving of Parliament, the imposition of taxes without consent, turned him from a monarch into a symbol of oppression. In contrast, Cromwell and his supporters spoke of liberty, of a more just and democratic England, one free from the absolute authority of kings. But even Cromwell, as the war dragged on, would come to learn the price of power. His own rise to prominence, fueled by his military genius and his devotion to the Puritan cause, brought him to the attention of those who had no interest in simply defeating the king, but in remaking England in their own vision. The war, however, was not simply a conflict over power. It was a war fought with betrayal at its very core. Both sides sought not only military victory, but political advantage, and behind the battlefronts, a complex web of conspiracies and alliances took shape. The Royalists were not a unified force, and their divisions, as well as their inability to read the shifting tides of political and military power, led to their downfall. The parliamentarians, meanwhile, were not immune to their own intrigues. Cromwell, who had once been seen as a mere soldier, would eventually emerge as the leader of the parliamentary cause, not by simple military victories, but through strategic alliances and a deep understanding of the political landscape. The turning point came in 1645, when the parliamentarians, under Cromwell's leadership, defeated the Royalists at the Battle of Naseby. The loss was devastating for Charles, who had placed much of his hopes in his army's success. By now, it was clear that the king was not only losing the war, but losing control over the fate of the monarchy itself. But the path to his eventual downfall was not yet complete. The parliamentarians, though victorious in battle, still had to reckon with the king's refusal to acknowledge their authority. His obstinate refusal to yield would ultimately bring him to trial. The trial of Charles I is one of the most dramatic moments in English history, and it remains a source of deep debate. The king, who had once commanded absolute loyalty, now found himself in the dock, accused of high treason. His response to the charges was defiant. He refused to recognize the legitimacy of the court, declaring that only God could judge a king. Yet his defiance only sealed his fate. On January 30th, 1649, Charles was executed before an astonished crowd, his head severed from his body by an axe, a dramatic end to the man who had believed in the divine right of kings. The execution was a moment of profound significance, marking not just the end of the king's life, but the end of the concept of monarchy as an unassailable institution. It was an act of defiance that signaled the dawn of a new age. With Charles's death, the monarchy was abolished, and England briefly became a republic under the leadership of Oliver Cromwell. The execution of a king, once thought impossible, signaled that no power, not even that of the crown, was beyond question. Yet, despite the death of the monarchy, the struggles for power were far from over. Cromwell, who had led the forces of Parliament to victory, would find himself in a position where he too had to contend with the tensions of leadership and the power vacuum left by the king's death. Eventually, Cromwell's own regime became increasingly authoritarian, and the dream of a more democratic England began to fray at the edges. After Cromwell's death in 1658, the monarchy was restored under Charles II, but the events of the Civil War would forever shape the future of England. The story of the English Civil War is, in many ways, the story of the constant tug-of-war between power and principle. The conspiracies that thrived during this time, from secret military alliances to covert royalist resistance, underscore the fact that in moments of crisis, those who hold power are never immune to betrayal, and those who seek to challenge power are never without their own internal conflicts. It is a story of ambition and revenge, of hope and despair, and of a nation that was, for a time, torn apart by its own contradictions. In the end, the Civil War was not just a battle for the English throne, but for the very soul of the nation itself. The restoration of the monarchy in 1660, following the death of Oliver Cromwell and the chaotic period of the English Commonwealth, was an event of both relief and apprehension. The return of Charles II to the throne marked the end of a republic that had never truly settled into stability. The collapse of Cromwell's authoritarian rule and the subsequent invitation to Charles, the son of the executed Charles I, to take the crown, was seen by many as the nation's return to order. However, what many failed to realize was that Charles II's reign would be anything but a simple restoration of the old ways. In the shadows of this restored monarchy, conspiracies would once again fester, deepening the intrigue that had already plagued the English crown for generations. Charles II, unlike his father, understood the precariousness of his position. His father's execution had cast a long shadow over the monarchy, and the events of the Civil War remained fresh in the collective memory of the nation. The king's return to the throne was greeted with both celebration and suspicion. The royalists were jubilant at the return of their monarch, but the parliamentarians, although forced to concede the return of the crown, remained cautious. The kingdom was divided, and Charles, who had spent years in exile, knew he would have to carefully navigate the shifting allegiances of a politically fractured England. What set Charles II apart from his predecessors was his ability to play the political game with skill and grace. He knew that the monarchy's strength no longer rested solely on divine right, but on the support of Parliament and the will of the people. Thus, he governed with an awareness of the need to keep both the royalist and parliamentary factions in balance, at least outwardly. However, beneath the veneer of cooperation, the monarchy's internal struggles continued, as the tension between the crown and Parliament, between royal authority and growing demands for reform, would never fully dissipate. It was during this delicate balance that a new wave of conspiracies began to form around the crown, taking shape against the backdrop of England's complex political landscape. The most significant of these was the so-called Popish Plot, a series of imagined and real plots centered around the fear of Catholic influence in England. The fear of Catholics, which had been a central theme throughout the reign of Elizabeth I, resurfaced during the reign of Charles II, exacerbated by the king's own personal inclinations towards Catholicism and the rise of Catholic sympathies within his court. His secret support for Catholicism, despite England's predominantly Protestant population, made him an unpopular monarch among the more zealous Protestants in his realm. In 1678, an explosive rumor began to circulate that a Catholic plot existed to assassinate Charles II and place his Catholic brother, James, Duke of York, on the throne. This Popish plot, fueled by paranoia, would have dire consequences for England, even though the conspiracies surrounding it were, for the most part, fabricated. The fear of Catholic conspiracies led to a full-blown witch hunt. A fervent campaign was launched to root out supposed Catholic plotters, with a particular focus on the so-called Jesuits, Catholic priests who were seen as agents of Rome and considered by many to be the hidden hand behind a potential restoration of Catholic rule in England. The Popish plot scandal was largely instigated by Titus Oates, a disgraced former priest who fabricated an elaborate story about a Catholic conspiracy to kill the king. Oates's accusations were not only outrageous, but, tragically, effective. His testimony led to a wave of arrests and executions, as a nation gripped by fear and religious animosity hunted down perceived Catholic enemies. Oates claimed that high-ranking Catholic nobles were involved in the plot, and even went as far as to implicate the Queen and members of the royal family. The accusations were fueled by a mixture of religious hysteria, political opportunism, and Oates's own bitter personal motivations. His testimony was compelling, and his influence on public opinion was extraordinary. However, the conspiracy was entirely based on fiction. Oates was eventually exposed as a fraud, but the damage he caused was irreversible. The consequences of the Popish plot rippled throughout English society. Several innocent people were executed as a result of Oates's accusations, and the trust in the judicial system was severely damaged. At the same time, the plot stoked anti-Catholic sentiments and led to a strengthening of Protestantism in England, ensuring that Catholics would remain marginalized and persecuted for years to come. Though Charles II's monarchy survived this wave of paranoia, the incident left deep scars, further sowing distrust between the monarchy and the people, and between the throne and its advisors. The legacy of the popish plot lingered throughout Charles II's reign, shaping his decisions and complicating his relationship with Parliament. In the wake of this scandal, Charles was forced to distance himself from his Catholic sympathies, attempting to placate the Protestant majority by making public declarations of loyalty to the Anglican Church. But while Charles was cautious and calculated, the resentment between factions in the kingdom remained alive, simmering beneath the surface. In addition to the religious strife, the latter part of Charles's reign was characterized by increasing foreign entanglements, many of which would contribute to the growing conspiracy-laden atmosphere at court. The king's numerous alliances with foreign powers, particularly France, which was Catholic, raised suspicions at home. His secret treaty with France in 1670, known as the Treaty of Dover, committed England to military support for France in exchange for substantial financial aid. This treaty, though political in nature, was perceived by many as a betrayal of English interests and a further sign of Charles's pro-Catholic inclinations. The French connection, coupled with his apparent disregard for the rising tide of anti-Catholic sentiment, kept the whispers of conspiracy alive throughout his reign. Even in his personal life, Charles was not immune to intrigue. His many mistresses, particularly his long-term relationship with Barbara Villiers, the Countess of Castlemaine, added a layer of scandal to his reign. Villiers, a woman of considerable ambition, was a constant presence at court, and her influence was seen by many as another form of hidden power, particularly because of her ability to manipulate Charles's affections. This allowed her to garner political favor and gain control over appointments, much to the frustration of the king's official advisors. The presence of powerful women in the court, with their own networks of influence, would become yet another arena of royal intrigue, where love, power, and ambition intersected in unpredictable and often dangerous ways. Despite these conspiracies, Charles II's reign, often referred to as the Merry Monarch period, also saw significant cultural and scientific advances, as well as a thriving art scene. The restoration of the monarchy brought with it the restoration of the arts, and the period was marked by the works of poets like John Dryden, playwrights like William Congreve, and painters like Sir Peter Lely. The king's court was known for its luxurious lifestyle, its excesses, and its embrace of pleasure. But beneath the glittering surface of court life lay the continuing challenges of managing a nation that was deeply divided, politically fractured, and riven with distrust. The conspiracies that threatened the monarchy's survival were a reminder that the crown, no matter how gilded, was always precariously perched on the edge of intrigue, suspicion, and betrayal. In the end, the shadow of conspiracy that hung over Charles II's reign would never quite dissipate. Although he managed to secure his throne and maintain a certain degree of popularity, the intrigue surrounding his court, the fears of a Catholic takeover, and the constant scheming among the nobility would continue to mark the later years of his reign. It was a turbulent period, one that sowed the seeds of future conflict and left a legacy of conspiracy that would resonate throughout English history for generations to come. Charles II died in 1685, and his death would pave the way for even more dramatic shifts in the balance of power, culminating in the Glorious Revolution and the eventual overthrow of his brother, James II, further solidifying the monarchy's relationship with Parliament and the notion of constitutional monarchy that would define England in the centuries to come. The death of Charles II in 1685, though peaceful in nature, marked the beginning of a new era in English history, one that would witness the ultimate overthrow of the monarchy, the unraveling of royal power, and the establishment of a constitutional framework that would fundamentally reshape the relationship between the crown and its people. His successor, James II, took the throne amid a landscape still rife with religious and political tensions. Unlike his brother, James was a fervent Catholic, and his ascension was met with immediate skepticism and alarm by the predominantly Protestant population of England. In the shadow of the popish plot and the lingering fears of Catholic conspiracies, James's reign became a lightning rod for both political and religious turmoil. James II's insistence on openly practicing and promoting Catholicism in a country that had been shaped by centuries of Protestantism was seen as a direct challenge to the established order. While Charles II had maintained a delicate balancing act, carefully managing his Catholic sympathies, James cast aside any semblance of restraint, appointing Catholics to key positions of power and attempting to create policies that would re-establish Catholicism as the nation's primary religion. For many, this was nothing short of a betrayal, not just of the Protestant cause, but of the memory of the English Civil War and the very principles that had led to the overthrow of his father, Charles I. The increasingly authoritarian nature of James's rule, compounded by his religious policies, sparked growing unrest among both the political elite and the general populace. What followed would be a dramatic and pivotal moment in the history of English monarchy, the Glorious Revolution of 1688. The seeds of rebellion had been planted not only in the royal court, but also within the ranks of the nobility and the military. The situation grew increasingly dire as James's grip on power weakened, and dissent grew louder, particularly among key figures within the Protestant establishment. The key turning point came when James, in an attempt to strengthen his position, allowed his second wife, Mary of Modena, a Catholic princess, to give birth to a son in 1688. This raised the specter of a Catholic heir to the throne, something that was unacceptable to many Protestants who feared the return of Catholic rule and the repeal of the Protestant Reformation. In response to this crisis, a small but influential group of nobles, including some members of James's own family, sought a way to remove him from power. Their solution came in the form of an invitation to William of Orange, the Dutch stadtholder and the husband of James's Protestant daughter, Mary. William was a powerful military leader and a committed Protestant, and the invitation to him was a carefully crafted political move designed to safeguard Protestantism and prevent a return to Catholic rule. What followed was a calculated gamble that would forever change the course of English history. In November of 1688, William landed in England with an army, and the political revolution that ensued unfolded with remarkable swiftness. James, unable to rally sufficient support, was forced to flee to France, and within weeks he had been deposed without a single shot being fired in battle. William's arrival marked not just a change of monarchs, but the beginning of a new political order in England. The Glorious Revolution was both bloodless and profound, as it led to the drafting of the Bill of Rights in 1689, which placed critical limitations on the power of the monarchy and affirmed the supremacy of Parliament. The deposition of James II was not merely a matter of dynastic succession, but a seismic shift in the nature of royal power. It was, in many ways, the culmination of decades of political and religious struggles, from the reign of Elizabeth I to the English Civil War, and from the assassination plots of the Gunpowder Plot to the fraught reign of Charles II. The Glorious Revolution demonstrated that the monarchy was no longer an unchallengeable institution. It could be deposed and replaced if it strayed too far from the will of the people or the will of Parliament. The monarchy had to coexist with a new reality, a constitutional monarchy, one where the power of the crown was no longer absolute, but constrained by law. The new political order under William and Mary ushered in a period of stability, but also one of constant political tension. The religious divisions that had plagued England for centuries were far from over, and the monarchy, while restored, was now part of a larger system of checks and balances. The Bill of Rights, which was passed shortly after William and Mary's ascension, placed firm restrictions on the monarchy's power. It laid the groundwork for a modern parliamentary system, which shifted the balance of power away from the sovereign and towards elected representatives. The monarch was still a figurehead, a symbol of the state, but the real power resided in Parliament. However, the story of royal conspiracies did not end with James's flight to France. The Glorious Revolution itself was a dramatic example of the ways in which power was won and lost in the courts of Europe, often through intrigue, manipulation, and military might. While James II was the one to be deposed, the forces that had worked against him, including those who saw his Catholicism as a threat, were just as much a part of the ongoing web of conspiracies that defined the political landscape. The political machinations that led to his downfall had been in the works for years, driven by the concerns of both political elites and common people, who saw the threat of a Catholic monarch as a dire possibility. Even as the monarchy was reshaped in the wake of the Glorious Revolution, the nature of royal conspiracies remained ever present. The rise of constitutional monarchy did not bring an end to intrigue at court or the undercurrents of political manipulation. The ruling elite, particularly the nobility, were keenly aware of the power dynamics that existed between Parliament and the Crown. The transition to a more parliamentary system did not quell the constant jockeying for power. Instead, it shifted the stage on which these power struggles played out. The aftermath of the Glorious Revolution also had profound implications for the future of royal legitimacy. The notion that a monarch could be removed from power, not by divine right, but by the will of the people and Parliament, had become a powerful precedent. This concept would reverberate through later English history, influencing the American Revolution and shaping the course of European politics for centuries to come. The monarchy, though it survived, was never quite the same. The balance of power had irrevocably shifted, and future monarchs would have to contend with a growing system of checks and balances that had been firmly established during this period. James II's downfall and the rise of William and Mary represented not just a change in rulers, but the final chapter in a long history of royal conspiracies and hidden agendas that had shaped empires throughout Europe. From the assassination plots of the Middle Ages to the scheming of Tudor courts, from the religious wars that tore through nations to the rise of absolutism, the tale of royal intrigue and conspiracy was one that transcended time. As the monarchy in England began to evolve into something more modern, more accountable, the shadows of past betrayals and hidden plots remained, a reminder of how far the monarchy had come, and of the price that had been paid to shape the future of the English crown. The legacy of the Glorious Revolution and the events that led up to it would resonate in the political landscape of Britain for centuries. It was the end of one era and the beginning of another, one in which power would no longer reside solely with the monarch, but with the elected representatives of the people. The monarch was still present, but its power was no longer absolute, and this delicate balance of power would become the hallmark of modern Britain. In the centuries following the Glorious Revolution, the English monarchy underwent a profound transformation. The divine right of kings, once the unshakable foundation of royal authority, had been permanently weakened. The crown, now bound by the constraints of Parliament and the expectations of the people, could no longer act with unchecked power. Yet even as the monarchy's political dominance waned, its symbolic power deepened. It became something quieter, something cloaked in ritual, ceremony, and image. And within this shift, the old patterns of secrecy and influence did not vanish. They simply changed shape. The conspiracies that once revolved around assassinations, religious wars, and overt coups began to retreat into subtler forms. Whispers behind palace doors, invisible alliances, and the intricate dance of diplomacy that defined the modern royal court. The 18th and 19th centuries marked a new age for royal intrigue, one governed by appearance, not command. Monarchs such as George III and later Queen Victoria found themselves in the delicate position of being both rulers and symbols, caught between the expectations of their subjects and the influence of those who governed in their name. The throne was no longer a seat of absolute power, but rather a mirror reflecting the ambitions of those who operated behind it. Ministers, advisors, financiers, and foreign powers all recognized that influence over the monarch meant influence over the nation, and so the court became a stage upon which power was performed through whispers, letters, and gestures, not declarations or decrees. The Hanoverian kings, particularly George I and George II, brought with them new forms of political secrecy. Foreign-born and initially mistrusted by their subjects, they relied heavily on ministers to manage the affairs of the realm. The office of the prime minister emerged during this period, crystallizing the shift in governance from royal decree to parliamentary rule. But this transition did not diminish conspiracy. It only relocated it. Behind every major decision, there were advisors competing for favor, factions within parliament scheming for dominance, and foreign powers weaving intricate webs of alliance and espionage. The monarchy, though quieter, was still surrounded by intrigue, its members often used as pawns in the diplomatic chess game of Europe. George III's reign, for example, was characterized by the tensions between royal will and parliamentary authority. His attempts to assert more direct control over the government were met with fierce resistance, and whispers of manipulation, madness, and secret influence soon followed. His mental illness, which would eventually incapacitate him, became a subject of both sympathy and suspicion. Who was truly ruling during his bouts of instability? Was it the prime minister, the queen, or the shadowy figures who surrounded the royal family? These questions lingered, not because of a lack of answers, but because secrecy had become an enduring feature of royal politics, a mechanism for maintaining mystique in an era where the monarchy's actual power was fading. Then came Queen Victoria, a monarch whose reign would define the 19th century and shape the modern image of royalty itself. She inherited a crown that was politically diminished, but symbolically potent. Her power lay not in her ability to rule directly, but in her influence, moral, emotional, and visual. The British Empire expanded dramatically under her reign, yet Victoria's own life was marked by profound isolation and a deep reliance on those closest to her. Among them was her husband, Prince Albert, whose intellect and reformist ideals profoundly shaped the monarchy's role in the industrial age. Together, they transformed the royal family into an emblem of stability, morality, and domestic virtue, a deliberate contrast to the decadence and scandal of previous generations. But even in this age of apparent moral clarity, conspiracies and hidden agendas thrived beneath the surface. The British Empire's expansion brought not only wealth and prestige, but also complex networks of espionage and control. The monarchy's influence stretched far beyond Britain's borders, and with that came countless secrets, colonial maneuverings, political manipulations, and the ever-present question of who truly benefited from imperial power. The royal household itself became a stage for subtle struggles between tradition and modernization, secrecy and transparency. Prince Albert's untimely death in 1861 left Victoria devastated, withdrawing from public life for years and plunging the nation into mourning. Yet behind her seclusion, the machinery of empire continued, with advisors and ministers shaping policy in her name, often without her direct oversight. During Victoria's later years, a peculiar contradiction took hold. She was simultaneously one of the most famous figures in the world and one of the least understood. The public saw her as the embodiment of virtue and continuity, but within the royal palaces, the old patterns of secrecy endured. Letters between courtiers and foreign dignitaries hinted at delicate negotiations, sometimes bypassing official government channels. Even the Queen's personal friendships, such as her controversial closeness to her Scottish servant, John Brown, sparked rumors of secret influence, manipulation, and improper power. Whether or not these suspicions were true mattered less than what they represented. A continuing fascination with the unseen forces that shaped the crown. As the Victorian age drew to a close, the British monarchy entered the 20th century transformed, both diminished in authority and elevated in mystique. The crown had become the embodiment of continuity in a rapidly changing world, yet its survival still depended on managing perception and concealing vulnerability. Monarchs like Edward VII and George V presided over a Britain grappling with industrial unrest, the suffragette movement, and the looming pressures of global conflict. Each royal decision, each alliance, was carefully curated to maintain public faith in the institution. And yet, even as the monarchy presented itself as a symbol of stability, the world around it was shifting, and with that, new forms of conspiracy were taking root. The early 20th century brought with it an age of information and propaganda. Wars were fought not only with weapons, but with words, and the monarchy, as ever, found itself at the center of narratives both noble and nefarious. During World War I, the royal family faced unprecedented scrutiny due to their German heritage. King George V, recognizing the growing hostility toward anything German, made the strategic decision to change the royal family's name from the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha to the House of Windsor in 1917, a symbolic act designed to preserve national unity and distance the crown from its foreign roots. It was a move both political and psychological, a reminder that the monarchy's survival depended as much on perception as on power. But as the modern age unfolded, the conspiracies that once defined the monarchy's relationship with power began to take on a different tone. No longer were they centered on assassination plots or secret coups. Instead, they revolved around influence, image, and the invisible machinery of public relations. The monarchy's role had become performative, a living symbol of continuity, carefully curated through public appearances, speeches, and rituals. Yet, behind the scenes, the same questions lingered. Who truly guides the royal family's decisions? What deals are struck in private between the crown and the government? And how much of the monarchy's public face is a mask, concealing the ancient machinery of power beneath? The history of this era reveals that the crown's survival has always depended on adaptation. Each monarch, from William and Mary to Victoria and beyond, faced the same dilemma: to remain relevant without revealing too much, to inspire loyalty without inviting scrutiny. The monarchy's evolution into a constitutional institution did not erase its conspiratorial past. It simply transformed it into something more subtle, more psychological. The secrecy once needed to maintain absolute rule was now essential to preserving the illusion of unity and stability in an age of democracy. And so, as the centuries passed, the monarchy became both more transparent and more opaque. Its rituals were televised, its events reported in minute detail, yet its true workings remained hidden, a paradox that continues to define it to this day. The line between fact and perception blurred, and in that liminal space, the old spirit of royal conspiracy endured, not as an open threat, but as a quiet whisper woven into the fabric of royal tradition. The crown, though polished and ceremonial, still carried within it the same shadows that had shaped empires and toppled dynasties. And for those who listened closely, the echoes of those past intrigues could still be heard, faint but unmistakable, beneath the pageantry of modern monarchy. As we arrive at the quiet close of this long journey through centuries of intrigue, the monarchy stands before us not as an untouchable relic of the past, but as a living paradox, ancient yet adaptive, ceremonial yet deeply strategic. The old corridors that once echoed with whispers of betrayal and the soft steps of spies now glow under the warmth of televised ceremonies, royal weddings, and global fascination. Yet, beneath the glittering surface, the same shadows remain, subtle, patient, and ever-shifting. The modern royal world, though outwardly tranquil, continues to be guided by an invisible hand. The same delicate dance of secrecy, symbolism, and survival that has defined its existence for over 1,000 years. The crown, once a weapon of divine right and conquest, has transformed into a vessel of continuity. Its power is now symbolic, its purpose woven into the identity of a nation. But even symbols can carry secrets. Behind every carefully measured appearance, behind each meticulously worded speech, lies a deep awareness of perception, the understanding that public trust is as fragile as any throne. The modern monarchy has learned that control no longer means decrees and armies. It means mastering the flow of narrative, shaping the story that the world tells about it. The royal image has become its strongest fortress, and every gesture, every silence, is a calculated act of preservation. In the age of information, the old conspiracies have not vanished. They have simply changed form. Where once daggers gleamed in candlelight, now rumors flicker across screens. Where alliances were once sealed with blood or marriage, they are now forged through public relations, diplomacy, and the careful curation of legacy. The monarchy still guards its mysteries, the closed meetings, the sealed archives, the coded language of state, but the battleground has shifted from the physical to the psychological. The struggle is no longer for the throne itself, but for the meaning of it. And in that struggle, the echoes of past intrigues find new life. Consider the royal family in the modern world, both adored and scrutinized, mythologized and dissected. Every movement, every expression becomes a symbol. The modern monarch, whether in the grandeur of Buckingham Palace or under the bright glare of international media, must walk a path lined with invisible pitfalls. One misstep can unravel decades of careful image building. One word can awaken old suspicions about what truly lies behind the polished facade. It is a strange kind of power, one that is both omnipresent and intangible. The modern crown wields influence through restraint, authority through silence. And perhaps that quietness, that deliberate stillness, is its most enduring weapon. But within this silence, the ghosts of history still whisper. The corridors of power have long memories. The same patterns that haunted kings and queens of old. Fear, secrecy, manipulation still linger in subtle ways. The monarchy's survival depends on its ability to absorb these ghosts, to transform them into myth rather than menace. The tales of betrayal and hidden agendas that once threatened to destroy it are now carefully retold as lessons, woven into documentaries, history books, and quiet late-night conversations. The crown has learned to own its conspiracies, to turn suspicion into fascination. In doing so, it keeps control not just over the past, but over how the past is remembered. When we trace the long arc from the Tudors to the Windsors, from swords to screens, a curious truth emerges, that the monarchy's greatest power has never been force, but illusion. The illusion of permanence in a world of change. The illusion of unity in times of fracture. The illusion of transparency, even as its true mechanisms remain hidden from view. To sustain this illusion requires mastery, not just of politics, but of performance. The modern monarch must be part sovereign, part actor, part diplomat. Every bow, every gaze, every public silence is a continuation of an ancient ritual, a coded message to those who still look for meaning between the lines. And yet, beneath all this formality lies something deeply human, the same vulnerability that has always haunted the crown. Every monarch, no matter how powerful or beloved, must confront the weight of history pressing upon them. They inherit not only titles and treasures, but centuries of fear, sacrifice, and secrecy. They wear the crown not just as an ornament of glory, but as a reminder of the cost of power, the loneliness that comes with it, the constant awareness that one misjudgment can awaken old ghosts. This is the paradox of monarchy. Its grandeur is built on fragility. It stands tall only because it has learned to bend without breaking. The conspiracies that once sought to tear down empires now serve as quiet reminders of what it takes to endure. Every rebellion, every whispered betrayal, every hidden alliance has become a thread in the intricate tapestry of royal survival. The crown's ability to outlast its enemies lies not in its might, but in its mystery, its refusal to be fully understood. Perhaps that is why, even in an age of relentless transparency, the monarchy still fascinates. There is comfort in its continuity, an allure in its unknowability. It embodies both history and myth, both truth and performance. It is a relic of the past and a reflection of our timeless human craving for order, story, and ritual. And so, as the world outside grows louder and faster, the monarchy remains a soft, steady presence, a heartbeat echoing through centuries. The great palaces that once sheltered plots and power struggles now stand as symbols of heritage and endurance. Yet, if one listens closely, beneath the grand ceremonies and polished speeches, one might still hear the same faint murmur that filled those halls in centuries past. The same quiet calculations, the same awareness that survival, for the crown, has always depended on secrecy as much as splendor. In the end, the story of royal conspiracies and hidden agendas is not merely about power, it is about transformation. It is the story of how an institution learned to cloak its vulnerabilities in tradition, how it turned danger into dignity, and how it continues to exist in a world that no longer believes in divine right. It reminds us that history is never truly still, that even in peace, there is strategy, even in ceremony, there is control, and that the true mystery of monarchy lies not in what it hides, but in how it endures. As the candlelight of the past fades and the calm of the present settles in, we are left with a lingering thought that the crown, though fragile, has always known how to survive. The faces upon the throne may change, the empires may rise and fall, but the essence of monarchy remains, a timeless balance between power and perception, silence and spectacle, history and myth. And as we drift into that gentle silence that follows history's last whisper, we realize that the greatest royal conspiracy of all may be the crown's quiet mastery of survival itself. An endless story, softly told, beneath the golden weight of time.